Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 25 of SCOTONOMICS. We've got a surprise mystery guest for you tonight before we have our interview. So the first thing I'd like to do, as always, is invite my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden. Hi, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good, William. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well. Really pleased to bring a special guest to talk about the delivering economic prosperity document that was released yesterday by the Scottish Government. But before we get to that, Kieran, how are you doing? How are you feeling about things, especially with everything that's going on in Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, it's very upsetting. Look, I greet quite a lot. Actually, I get quite upset when I hear people telling me what's happening to them on the radio. But interestingly, I said to you the other day that Switzerland has it's actually ditched its neutrality to sanction Putin. So that's a really big turnaround. That's something quite big, actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And welcome to everyone who's watching on Facebook, YouTube, and also now on Twitter. So thanks for joining us. Yeah, I don't know how you feel. But I wonder if everyone else feels a bit like this, but you get a sense of feeling really parochial when you're talking about things like Scotland or independence or economics or anything really when there's something so atrocious happening at the moment. But aside from that, we do have to keep doing what we are doing. And tonight we think we've got a very important topic to start with. And I would say our interview with our interview that's coming up is a little bit lighter, and we did it a few weeks ago, and hopefully it's not as intense as some of the other things we've been discussing. So we'll get to that interview, but first thing I'd like to do is introduce Dr. Lucas Hart, who's joining us this evening. Hi, Lucas. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm very good. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. Lucas is policy and engagement lead at the We Are Scotland Alliance. We've had Catherine Trebek on the show before, and we're well aware, and our audience will be as well, of the great work that you do. So thanks very much for finding the time to join us this evening. I'm sure our audience are aware. If not, the Scottish Government released a paper yesterday called Delivering Economic Prosperity, and it's a 50-odd page document. And I was wondering what, Lucas, you thought of it. Yes, before, I think it was on Monday, you'd got a group of... how would you describe the group that you got together to propose these 10 points?
Well, we like to describe ourselves as the Transform Our Economy group, but it's basically a kind of collaboration of various NGOs in Scotland. So it's mostly Friends of the Earth Scotland, it's us, Wellbeing Economy, the Alliance Scotland, the Scotland Environment Link. And for these 10 points, we also work together with a few others, which I'm not all going to list. But so that was really our idea of trying to hammer out a bit more what we would like to see from the strategy when it was announced last year that it would be coming.
Okay, great. So there's 10 points. I read the 10 points yesterday, and then I read the document today. And if I'm being generous, I'm going to say that the report scored 1 out of 10. And I think that I would give it pass marks for the first one, which was the goal, well-being for all within environmental limits. As a statement, I do think that the report had some kind of tipped its hat towards that. But the other 9 points, which I'll post, actually, they're in the comments below this episode. I didn't think the report matched any of them at all. But that's my thoughts. What's your thoughts on that, Lucas?
I think overall I tend to agree with you. So the good bits, let's start with the good bits. Is the overall framing, as you mentioned. So the goal of the strategy, it acknowledges the vast transformation we need. We have, like on Monday, the IPCC published another report on climate change that we really have a short window left if we want to have a livable planet, basically. So we have to massively reduce our carbon emissions. At the same time, we're facing, as you well know, we're facing problems with poverty, with insecure work, and our care system is creaking, and all of these. So we have to kind of address climate change and do something about that, while also making, transforming our economy to make life better for everyone. And the report does acknowledge that, like strategy. It does say we have to address these things like poverty and inequality, but also within the limits. It explicitly says within environmental limits. So that is very welcome. I think, and it does have some little bits and pieces in there that can help with that. Like they introduced a wellbeing economy monitor, which is supposed to go measure what we really need rather than GDP. It has something on community wealth building, on building fair work criteria into contracts. But yeah, I think overall these are really kind of add-ons rather than at the core of the strategy. And they should really be at the heart of the strategy, I think.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, you picked up on the point there that within the report, it said that we're going to address the climate crisis, and it was kind of saying, we were going to do that. But on the same side, it said, and it starts, the report envisages an economy in 2032 that significantly outperforms the last decade in terms of economic performance. And that said, our vision. And that's not my vision. Because in a world facing a climate crisis that's caused by economies trying to outperform their current growth, this is just not possible. And I think it completely undermines any report that continually talks about growth and export strategies and growth that also wants to reduce the impact on the climate crisis. Because to do that, we've got to decouple economic growth from emissions and from waste. And I can't see how those circles can be squared. And I couldn't see anything in the report that added that would allow me to see that that was even considered.
No, I think, yeah, I think you're right in that sense that, well, from my perspective, it's about kind of, rather than just asking, do we want more economic growth? It's about what do we actually want? Like, and that is reducing carbon emissions and ensuring everybody has what they need. And that should be our priorities. And then we have to transform our economy that happens. And then whether the economy grows or not, I don't really care, to be completely honest, or especially measured by GDP. But
Absolutely.
yeah, so, and I think that's really what the strategy is kind of lacking, in terms of what it focuses on is very much these kind of traditional, like I would say maybe last century's kind of economic strategies. It's all about productivity, it's all about innovation, it's all about starting businesses, it's all about growth, but it doesn't really lay out how we can make sure it's the right kind of productivity and the right kind of innovation. So like, and the right kind of businesses that can bring us towards that vision and that goal of
which of course is difficult in a 50-odd page report. We can only expect it to do so much. I did want to read you a summary, and I know Kieran's then got a question for you after that, but this is what Laurie McFarlane, who's appeared on the show before, so he's a columnist for Open Democracy, and he's an economist, and he blogged today and he said, this is not a programme of national economic transformation, it's a programme for economic continuation. We'll put a link into it. It's a brilliant summary, I think. At a time when muscular industrial policy is making a return globally, it's strange to watch Scotland embrace an approach that would be more at home in the 1990s than the 2020s. And I think that's a pretty damning summary for a report which is supposed to be looking at the future.
Yeah, I think that I read that piece. I think it's really good, so I can fully recommend that. I think what really struck home with me was one of his other quotes where he was like, the strategy is really, it's attracting investors, and it's about productivity and kind of asking them to do the job for us. It's not actually setting out how we're going to do it. And I think that's kind of one of the things that came out.
Yeah, I found it interesting that sorry, Karen, go on.
I was just going to say, I mean, do you think that it's always going to be the case that people that are working in a government, which is not really what's not monetarily sovereign, they're always going to be focusing on how to get more currency into the country? They don't have full taxation powers, so they also can't stop currency, leaving the country. They're always going to be trying to find ways of getting currency into the country.
I think there's possibly some truth to that, but I think in terms of the Scottish government, I think they could have done a lot more with the powers they have around taxation, and that's hardly mentioned in the strategy, for example. And I think really one of the key points I think that is missing, that is quite important for me, is that they haven't really gone out to actually ask and engage with Scottish communities what this transformation and what the strategy should be about. Like it's a 10-year strategy for economic transformation, and they really should, it's important, or they say it's important. So I think that you really need to hear all the voices across Scotland to make sure you have the right transformation for what people need. And I think the strategy, one of the big problems is that they haven't really done that like engagement process. They had obviously a consultation and you could go, but they haven't gone out to people who wouldn't come naturally to them and speak to them.
So do you think perhaps a faster solution to that, as opposed to collecting data all around the country? I've actually just got my census through today, so there's going to be a lot of data collected on that as well. But perhaps a people's assembly on the economy, what people expect.
Yeah. No, I think that was something like that. I mean, I think it would be a great idea. I mean, especially if you look at the existing output of the assemblies, like they've been actually, you can really see Scottish people are up for the economic transformation. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. It's about, I think in the climate
There's a
assembly,
huge amount of really good stuff going on across the country, and I do think that people became much more aware and had much more understanding around the economy following the referendum in 2014. And we're obviously trying to do our bit. I'd like an answer from both of you on this question from Hashbury. Do you think it was necessary to mention independence in a 10-year plan? I think that's why it was only 56 pages, because we know that we're going to be independent next year. But I wonder what both of you think. Kieran, what do you reckon?
Well, I think that they will also do a plan for independence. That will come as the next white paper for independence. So that will be in there. This is the plan for our given situation right now, which is a devolved government.
And Lucas?
I don't see, given that this is a strategy for the current situation, I'm not sure it would have been absolutely necessary to mention it. But then given that obviously the SNP ran on a platform that they would try to achieve independence, I'm not surprised to see it.
I just found the whole process bizarre, and looking at a 10-year plan that didn't envisage independence, and I would have had the callousness to say, actually, our plan is for the next 2 years, because we're going to be independent after that. And if we don't get independence, then we'll come up with a plan for the next 8 years. But I just found it was just a little bit bizarre, the whole process. A final question here, and I think this is a really good question from Hashbury, because I think, Lucas, this gets to your point about growth and growth for the sake of it. So see what you think to this.
I think this is, I think this question is potentially, I would ask it the other way around. I would ask, basically, what do we need to accommodate immigration, and how can we have immigration in an economy that, where we also need to reduce carbon emissions, and I think we definitely can, like it's the no-brainer, like, we can accommodate what immigration can. There's enough work to be done. We need to care for our people, we need to plant new trees, we just need to set up the economy in a way that these jobs and these ways are there. We definitely got enough space in Scotland. So yeah, I think, and then, as I say, if we manage to accommodate all the immigrants who want to come here and also achieve the other goals of well-being, then it doesn't matter whether the economy has grown in the end or not. I think it's just
I agree completely. I think that you've got to look at what you're trying to do, and if you have to grow an economy to attract immigrants, and that's what you want to do, then fine. But if you can do it through another means, you don't have to necessarily do it that way. Well, Lucas, thanks very much for joining us at such short notice. We'd love to have you on in a few months, maybe when I know you've only been there for a few months, so maybe when you've properly got your feet under the table, you can come back on. But thanks very much for joining us. We've got your contact details, and we'll make sure that people can click on and can follow you. But thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Lucas.
Thank you for asking me, and hope the rest of the show goes well.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I like when we do that, have nice people just joining us fairly randomly to chat through. Overall, Kieran, I know you've been really busy doing some other stuff, but you had a chance to look through a little bit of the report, and having heard Lucas, have you got any thoughts before we move on to our interview with Patricia?
Yeah, I think it's good that they did mention that GDP isn't the be all and end all, and the community wealth building. And that, there is the mention of, trying to engineer out inequality. These are all good things, but I didn't get as far as in the report as you. I'm out doing physical work for Independence just now as well.
Yeah, indeed. You've been very busy today. No, that's interesting. But I do recommend everyone has a look through. It's actually it's quite a good document in the sense that it's a fairly easy read. It's certainly a lot easier than the Sustainable Growth Commission. It's probably more along the kind of white paper. It's quite easy to get into. But I do think it's important because I think it shows what this particular administration envisages for Scotland when it's moving towards independence. And I certainly think there's some conversations and discussions that will come out from that. And when you're talking about GDP, it's worth saying that we've actually got a brilliant show coming up in a couple of weeks looking at the
Genuine Progress Indicator.
Genuine Progress Indicator, yeah, and which I would hope something that the Scottish Government could look at. Okay, well, let's move on to the main bit of tonight's show, our interview with Patricia. Kieran, would you like to do a little introduction?
Yeah, so today we're going to introduce Patricia Pinot to our audience, and she's actually an engineer by trade, and she's just recently completed a master's in economics. She is the co-host of the MMT podcast. So she's got some interesting insights into what it's like to understand MMT, but then also to then delve into the world of neoclassical economics and the neoclassical economic thinking. So this is really interesting.
Yeah, and especially with someone who's got an engineering view of economics. I found it really, really engaging and really interesting. I hope you all enjoy it. Kieran, I'll see you after the interview.
Okay. So, welcome, Patricia Pinot, to SCOTONOMICS. We're really pleased to have you today. So,
thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
Patricia, you're an engineer by trade, but you're also the co-host of the MMT podcast, and you recently completed an economics master's. But first of all, I'd like to know a little bit more about your day job.
Oh, my day job. It's very geeky. I trained as a mechanical engineer graduated 2003 and 2008. Sorry, I started 2003. And I straight in went into the built environment and doing as well as the oil and gas sector, doing CFD, and a mixture of things. And then I settled back again into the built environment, but doing sort of wind engineering, pedestrian comfort, indoor air studies, thermal comfort. So everything basically of a building that you don't see. So we say that good engineering is that engineering which you don't notice because everything is working great and you don't feel uncomfortable or anything like that.
That makes complete sense. So now tell us why you got interested in economics. When did that happen?
Well, I think it has to do with the time that I graduated. I graduated during the Great Recession, and there was little work. And I think people were starting to grapple with the weaknesses of our economic system. And there was a lot of information out there on banks. And it just sparked my curiosity and about how the whole thing works. And but it took a few years for me to make the leap. I think it was after the austerity measures started being proposed in the UK, and there was a lot of talk about, the debt is too high because of the financial crisis, and we need to reduce it. And there was this real sense of urgency from politicians about the debt. And, a very simple question that arose in my head was, well, how do you know the debt is too high? And I don't know if that sort of line of inquiry is related to my job in a sense, but I really hate not knowing how things work and why behind things. So the first thing I did was go an inquiry with friends who had actually studied economics, and I thought, well, they'll know, they'll be able to tell me. And it was very obvious very quickly that they didn't know. They would give me answers like, oh, it's really difficult to tell because you need, you don't know for sure, and this and that. And so, I contrasted that against the very kind of self-assured tone that used by politicians at the time of the debt is too high and we need to reduce it. And it just sort of, it became obvious to me, you know, they're lying, right? They don't know. They just want it to be high. And the idea was that, well, if you cut welfare, if you have to, you know, cut benefits and push a lot of people into poverty, then you better make sure that, you know, you're doing it for a good reason, and that this is not just kind of false alarms, if any sense. So it really pushed me into trying to understand, you know, why don't they know when the debt is too high? It just also seemed really confusing to me that nobody would know why. And I started in mainstream economics, sort of trying to understand the answers, and there was nothing there that clicked, that made sense from a logical perspective, until a friend of mine who worked with me suggested I read Bill Mitchell's blog. And it took me a while to understand it because it's very heavy, as you know. But when it clicked, it just, everything fell into place. And suddenly I understood a lot. I mean, it's an understanding of the mechanics of money, obviously, but there's also an understanding of the political aspects of money. And it made sense, you know, not just, okay, when is there too much debt, which is never, but also, why are politicians saying this? You know, what role does austerity play in the whole redistribution of income and that? So yeah, that was pretty much my journey.
How long did it take you to realize that? From, I'm looking at it, I'm reading some traditional kind of classical economics books and I'm not finding the answers, to that moment when you thought, I get this?
Oh God. I think at the beginning it was very slow. I think it wasn't up to 2010, 2011 that I was seriously inquiring about this. And then it wasn't until maybe a couple of years later when it really clicked. And since then, the thing about it is that once it does, you can no longer divorce yourself from it. You are involved now. you are committed, and you feel a certain responsibility to do something about it. So I thought to myself, I'm either going to be, you know, screaming at the TV for the next 5 years because of this, or I'm gonna have to go out there and actually try and do something productive and to change things.
Yeah, that sounds like probably something as well that maybe comes from your being an engineer as well, to do something practical about it.
Yeah.
Is that how you ended up doing the MMT podcast with Christian?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lucky opportunity from my point of view, because he was actually the one with he's a showman, of course. He's really good at what he does, at entertaining people, and he liked podcasts very much. And I didn't know anything about podcasts at the time, but I was doing what I knew how to do, which was to like write little articles here and there to try and help disseminate information on MMT. And then he decided to have me as a test guest on the podcast right at the beginning. I think I was the first one, pretty sure I was. And just to talk about MMT and to talk about one of the articles I had written. And it was a really good dynamic. And at the end of that episode, which we had at a local pub in London, we were having a beer and he said, we should just do this like really like regularly. And I went, sure, why not? You know, and that's really when the whole thing started. But I realized I really like talking to people. You know, I don't know, sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, but it's just something that, I really enjoyed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've enjoyed the MMT podcast over the years. I found it really, really interesting. I've listened to most of them. So going on from that, I wanted to maybe go to the fact that you've just finished a master's in economics. And I think that was a really interesting choice, because I would have imagined that there'd be some cognitive dissonance when you were doing that master's. How was that for you?
Again, I think now that I look back at all my decisions since I started even becoming interested in economics, a lot of it was informed by my approach to engineering. And, you know, since the whole kind of curiosity of it and wanting to know how things worked when it came to choosing a degree, you know, by the time I decided, no, I'm going to do a master's, it was just a moment to make what I felt that I already knew official. And I thought it would give me new tools and sort of more insight into how things worked. And by how things work, I mean to say, whether we like it or not, the mainstream, well, is the mainstream at the moment. And in order to change things, you need to understand how things work at the moment. So I wanted to understand their mindset, understand where they were coming from. And, you know, I was prepared for it to have an influence on myself as well. And sort of learn, you know, what, because I think that sometimes what can happen is, if you don't have that, if you don't immerse yourself into the other side's point of view, you can get a very caricatured idea of what their intentions are, of what the motivations are behind that. And what I find is that things are far more complex than they're typically portrayed. And these systems kind of perpetuate themselves due to a variety of influences. It's not just, you know, one single core motive. And I really wanted to understand that. So that was my view. But also because, you know, I was lucky enough to have a scholarship for what is I consider to be a really good university, and it just was an opportunity that I really couldn't pass.
So I wanted to get a bit more about your experiences of doing that and interactions with the teachers and also interactions with the other students. So can you tell us a little bit about how that was and what interesting things occurred during the time that you did this master's?
And also, how annoying were you for everyone else when you kept putting up your hand saying, actually, can I just double check, because I don't,
Yeah, I was probably very annoying looking back. There were a couple of moments when, yes, I got really frustrated because I felt that what was being implied, maybe, and this is not the teacher's fault, it's just that the theory implies a certain view of human beings that I didn't agree with. I very aggressively did not agree with. And, you know, the whole thing was done through using Teams because it was in the middle of the pandemic. And luckily I had the opportunity.
So people could put you on mute then.
Yes, they can. But I, you know, I had the ability to like scream on my own, and well, nobody knew any better, no? So maybe that helped a little bit. But I mean, most of my experience was confirmed what I already understood about the mainstream in terms of what the theory says. What I understood a little bit more about how it developed, and I thought that was really useful. And I understood a little bit more.
Could you maybe expand on that?
Well, they don't give you a detail of, you know, economic history, and there should be. I wish they had. But they do give you a little bit of, okay, so, you know, Friedman said this, and then another person picked that up and changed it into this. And you realize that, and you know, how the Phillips curve developed and how it's gone through various transformations over time. Initially, it was about wage inflation, and then it became about just inflation in general. At first, it was about employment, and then it became about output. But through that, you see, I started to understand it as a bit of a compromise between what they considered to be the progressive side and the non so progressive side. So the really conservative monetarists versus the new Keynesians, basically. And where we are now, it seems to be more the result of a negotiation between those two sides rather than the result of a, you know, scientific method. And of course, you know, the new Keynesians feel like, you know, they were pushing the more humane side of the argument in a sense, but as we know, is limited in that regard as well from an MMT perspective. And they both agree on very major things. You know, they both agree on the fact that the government is constricted financially, and that in itself restricts the amount of action you can take to help people and to shape markets, and that's where we're at. So I think that's partly why there is a lot of contradictions in the theory, because you have two slightly different sides trying to push their own narratives, and so what you get at the end is not necessarily consistent.
But in essence, they're still very much agreeing with, you know, the majority of the principles, aren't they? And I think, look, when I did my economics degree at uni, I would love to have started where did this thought come from? Why do we think that people are rational? Where is the evidence for this? Why do we think that we're able to kind of use everything as a resource and treat everything in nature like it's another input? That was all just kind of, it just starts with, okay, here we are, we've got stuff, we need to use it to make things for us for us to be wealthier. And you have to kind of start there. And when you start there, everything kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It all makes sense, but you just kind of want to take a step back and say, well, hold on a minute, who gave us the right to treat the earth and other people as this kind of resource for us to just use? And where's this idea that individuals are able to make the best decision for themselves and for everyone else? We never got to do that. And again, that frustration must have been there when you've lived, you know, when you've lived, it's okay when you're 19 and you go to university, but when you've lived a bit of life and you start thinking, but that's just not true. Do you have any moments like that, or were there any phrases that you thought, not that phrase again?
There was a particular moment that, you know, it was a while after I started where it really frustrated me, particularly because I was, you know, I was also sharing spaces. I could speak to the other students and sort of get a sense of how they absorb the information. You know, most of them were much, much younger than me. And, you know, they came at it from fresh, young eyes, whereas I come at it from I've already had a job and gone through all these experiences, and now I'm revisiting uni. But basically, it was about it was the macroeconomics class actually, and it was about the general equilibrium model and including unemployment equilibrium. And there was a statement made about how wages, if wages went too low, then workers would not be offering their employment because it's not worth working, and therefore you need to, you know, that is the kind of balance between workers choosing not to work and how much employers need the workers, etc., that arrives at the right kind of level of unemployment. But there was an implicit assumption that workers could choose not to work. And so I made that explicit question. I said, are you saying that workers basically choose not to work? And the response I got was something in line of, well, yes, because there are certain countries where unemployment is higher because welfare is too high, you know, and there's no incentive to work. And I found that really disappointing. But later on, speaking to other students, and these are, you know, these are all people who otherwise in other situations have very good intentions. They all feel like, you know, they want to help people and they want to do what's best. It's just that they consider these things to be almost fact, and therefore you have to work within these constraints. And other students, when I said, I don't think that doesn't make sense to me, that people could have a choice not to work. I mean, if you don't work, you starve, period. And the other students were like, well, within this, I guess it makes sense. Within a very reduced version of, you know, within the conditions that they had said, yes, I guess it makes sense. But only if you put the blinkers on the side of your head and understand it like that. And then I realized that I guess that it wasn't that these students didn't want to be good economists. It's just that they were very much focused in the moment of, I need to get a good job. I need to do well in this class and get a good job. And then I'll have the opportunity to actually have an impact in society. But you have to go through the motions. And that in itself encourages a certain degree of unwillingness to, you know, rock the boat, and because you don't want to be perceived as problematic. You just want to really, the most efficient way to get through all this is to just learn what you're given and do well at the tests. And that's it. So I was doing it because I'm crazy, I guess. you know, but and because I had other interests, I already had a career, so I had less to lose, I guess, than these other students. And yeah, that's one of the kind of key moments where I felt like I learned something about, well, human beings and about how these ideas perpetuate without having to necessarily rely on the notion that, oh, human beings are just bad intentioned and, you know, they just want to hurt people.
Yeah, and then you remind me of when I went to art school when I was about 24. So I had worked for a number of years before I went to art school. And, you know, at one of the lectures, one of the teachers said to me, Modigliani was thinking this when he did this. And I just came out and went, how could you possibly know that? What are you talking about? So I think, and I also did quite a lot of that when I did my science degree, which I just graduated from in 2015. And so I think every course needs to have lots of mature students going, but why?
But why? Yes.
You can
Yeah.
see for people that pressure to pass, get a job, be independent financially, restricts their ability to possibly exhibit independent thinking that might threaten their potential income in the future.
Well, I guess there's an element of that, as I said, but there's also, I think one of the key aspects for me was that the curriculum itself, and this probably has to do as well with funding pressures of universities. The curriculum itself is very lean in terms of focus on the, you know, on the facts that you gotta get through, on the material that you gotta get through, and there was very little time for additional discussion or encouraging even, you know, questioning from students and alternative points of view. We got some of that amazingly through some of the tutorials, because in the tutorial sometimes you'd get through the exercise quicker, and the person teaching you would be a teaching assistant for the most part, and they were, you know, telling us about the research that they were doing a little bit, and that encouraged a bit of discussion. But I really wish there had been a lot more. I think it was very, maybe COVID had something to do with it as well, because the program was very much compressed as a result of COVID, and the lack of face-to-face interaction can make things worse as well. But there were very few opportunities in which to actually, you know, encourage the students to get new ideas, you know, think about a different way of doing things. And that was, I remember that being different in my engineering course, where actually we were encouraged to be more creative about current problems that hadn't been solved. And yeah, and as I said, it may be a matter of change of circumstances in general. It may be a matter of change of styles at university, or it may be a matter of change of just the subject matter in it.
Yeah, you talk about some of the illogical things that you come across. For example, you know, people are rational, which is, you know, it was very surprising for me when I came across that, because it's like, well, have you ever been out your front door? Because that's a crazy thing to say. But there was an interview you did with Stephen Hale, who we interviewed in our first program, where you said something along the lines, and I can never hear it exactly, but it was something along the lines of, you said, if we did that in our profession, we would be sacked. You remember what that was?
I can't remember what the question was, but I think it was about the point that I was making was that in engineering, you have or you are encouraged from a very early age to have a set of competencies that are considered to be essential for operating as an engineer. And the reason why they say that these competencies are important is because, you know, engineers have quite a high degree of responsibility as well. We need to make buildings that do not collapse. We need to make sure that the systems we design are not harmful to people. And there is no way of completely avoiding those risks. You know, engineers make mistakes all the time, but there are a set of kind of codes of conduct that you can have to avoid the most pervasive ways in which these mistakes are made. So, for example, to become a chartered engineer, which is kind of inbuilt into most engineers' head, that's the thing you have to get in order to arrive at a certain level in your career, is one of the first lines is that you commit to do a service to society, for example, and you commit not to accept briberies, and you commit to not have conflicts of interest that may influence on your work. And I think I always assumed that economists had the same thing, because if engineers have a lot of responsibility on the social side, then economists have even more responsibility on that side. So I always assumed that they did. And it's not to say that engineers necessarily agree on what it means to be of service to society. It's just that we're encouraged to think about that aspect of our job every time that we make a decision about it. So at university, for example, there was a lot of debate of whether students would be willing to work for weapons manufacturers or not. And it was an ethical debate. And it's not to say that everybody agreed on what to do. It's just that at the very least we were talking about it. And I didn't see much about that in economics. And I think that, yeah, there are certain small rules about, for example, explicit mentioning of assumptions at the beginning of a model, or certain steps that you need to do to check your model before you can actually implement it on a practical basis, release it as a product, or release a design of a building. Checks that it surprised me to learn weren't really part of the economics profession. That they are, I think they have this belief that if you have something like that in economics, then you are restricting thought in economics, or you are restricting creativity, or you are trying to kind of limit their.
I studied with a few engineers at university, and one of them was a mechanical engineer. A couple of my mates were civil engineers, and the idea that the mechanical engineer could just go and design a building was as ridiculous as it was that the civil engineers would go and try and set up, design batteries. But when we look at economists, and Professor Stephen Keen is quoted on us as one of our shows as saying, "These bloody idiots."
Okay. These idiots, I mean, these overstretched idiots believe they can apply their model to areas that they have no knowledge about whatsoever, which is climatology.
Economists are very arrogant about their models and their assumptions in a way that as a mechanical engineer, you would just be laughed out of a room with a group of civil engineers if you were trying to tell them that actually this was applicable to what they're doing. Do you agree with that? And can you see that difference between a proper discipline? Sorry, I hate to say it, a proper discipline like engineering, and then something slightly different like economics?
Well, I think there are egos everywhere. First of all, the thing about engineering is that, one of the good things about studying engineering is that once you're out of uni, you get an array of options of what you want to do. It's a numerical degree. You can go into finance if you want. You can, anything that requires math is good. You can go into hundreds of different types of engineering, more practical, more consultancy based, more client facing, more design based. And so in having all those options, you get obviously differences in wages and differences in the status that each of those jobs provides. And I find that there is a big temptation when you leave university to go into the finance sector, because it is one of the major sectors that hires from the numerical people, and the difference in wages between finance and an engineering consultant, for example, is enormous. So you find then that the people who actually stay in the engineering profession have actually gone through that thought process of, money or society or vocation, and they tend to be, therefore, people who do engineering, they tend to be more committed to the value of their work. They do see, they want to make sure that they do good work for the most part. And they, at least in recent years, more and more, a lot of them care about sustainability, and a lot of them care about trying to improve the world through new technology and new advances. And I think that in economics, I mean, I haven't experienced the economics kind of job environment, but I suspect that from what I've seen is that there is an awful lot of status associated with, reaching the top of your economics profession usually means working for a bank, if you don't want to do policy directly, and or working for the central bank, which is probably the same thing. And then, so there are different motivators there. And I think that maybe that's why the people who make it at the top of the economics profession tend to be of a certain kind of, have a certain idea of themselves within society, and a certain idea of what their wages mean. Whereas engineers are usually, in their heads at least, accepting, lower wages for better quality of job.
I think you've explained really well about the dangers of not maybe thinking about do no harm in your profession. Obviously medics have the same thing where they have to think about do no harm. And I'm interested to know that engineers actually have the same philosophy as well, which is clearly very important as well. But you're right. I mean, economists are often in very influential positions, and that should be something that should be part of their profession as well. And I think also that danger of siloization, which I think they suffer from as well. I remember reading about a couple of economists at the start, the beginning of the 20th century, who were trying to find the reason why the economy had expanded over this particular time, and they were looking at prices and things like that. And as soon as they mentioned the dates to me, I went, oh yeah, that was when sanitation came in. So, if you're interested, I have an interest in medical history, so I knew that right away. But if you're not talking to people outside of your profession and you're not mixing, then you're not going to see that point of view. So siloization, really a big problem in a lot of professions, I think. But I want to come back to your interest in MMT. So you describe how one night that really came to you, that you started to understand what Bill Mitchell was trying to teach you in his blogs. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
As I said, it suddenly clicked, and it clicked at 1 a.m. When I was about to try to go to bed, and my partner at the time didn't appreciate me waking him up to talk to him about this random thing called MMT. But I think what clicked about it is that I realized that I had everything upside down in my head. And maybe once again, engineers are very kind of visual people. They construct machines in their head and try to understand how a system works. And I realized that I was, putting the flow of taxes here and then the government here, trying to feed the government, and then the government does whatever it does. And then I realized, no, I've got that upside down. It starts the other way around. And once I did that, everything fell into place. And then, and I think immediately after came the shock of, oh my God, austerity is terrible. And so as I said, it is a technical recognition, and then it follows the kind of the ethical implications of that system. So now that I think about it, this idea of putting it upside down is that this taxes and government down here, it could really be seen as a private sector and then government. Whereas if you turn it upside down, you realize, well, government, then private sector. It can also be a metaphor for the hierarchy of power, in the system. And suddenly, if you understand things that you understand that the market is created by the government, you understand that the private sector isn't kind of enabling the government in any financial kind of way, then you realize where the power lies, and you realize that there are all these options available that you hadn't considered, and that the solutions that you had been thinking about, how to change the world, under which most people operate, under which most economists operate, is really a restricted view of the economy, because it immediately rules out the government as from being able to make any meaningful change, and being quite severely financially constrained.
I think it'd be really good for our listeners and those watching for you just to sum up what MMT is.
That question is hard. It's very difficult. MMT is a description of the monetary system. So a lot of people think that it's a new policy that has to be introduced to change things. It is not. It's how things work as it is now. It's just a new way of looking at how the monetary system works, what the relationship between the government and the private sector is when it comes to money. The thing is that, and why it's so popular amongst activists, is that once you understand it in this way, it opens, as I said, a lot of policy options that you hadn't considered. And MMTs have very different views about the right policy options, but they all agree on the main MMT kind of policy proposal, which is the job guarantee. And the reason why they focus on the job guarantee is because at the moment, the way that we look at inflation and unemployment is, as I said, a monetary system where monetary policy where you have to adjust interest rates and somehow balance unemployment and inflation, and there is kind of a sweet spot where you get the right level, and that's what they call the natural rate of unemployment, or the NAIRU, sometimes they call it. MMT does away with that. MMT says you don't have to compromise. You don't have to throw people under the bus and accept that there's going to be a certain amount of people permanently unemployed or who are undergoing poverty at any one time. You can ensure full employment and you can ensure price stability. And the policy by which to do that is the job guarantee. So that's why the job guarantee is so important to MMT, to the point where I would say, and I think quite a few MMT economists would agree with me, that it is an intrinsic part of the MMT framework. It's like what replaces the Phillips curve effectively. But everything else, is really optional policies on top of that.
So, you can spend money on giving your friends who have pretend PPE businesses, you can give money to them, or you can actually maybe enable people who have perhaps the machinery to create PPE to actually do it properly. It's really a political choice, and what your political choices are.
Yeah, so MMT, I think it works under a few premises. The first premise would be that a monetary sovereign government, one that issues its own currency, can never run out of its own currency, and does not need taxes or debt to fund that spending. A lot of people will note that there are countries out there that issue their own currency, but they have a lot of debt, and they have other resource constraints. Well, MMT talks about the availability of resources, of real resources, workers or materials or machinery, as the key limiting factor in that spending. So it forces you to think about what you have in your economy and what you can mobilize as the limiting factor in what you can provide for your population, rather than just an arbitrary money constraint or financial constraint.
Patricia, I want to thank you very much for coming on to SCOTONOMICS and explaining your experiences both as an engineer and now a newly freshly minted economics graduate. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. I had a really good time.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Kieran, what did you think of that, watching it back again?
Well, I think Patricia is probably the most rational people that I've met. She really does take a scientific viewpoint. She's got an understanding of how central banking works. She's delved deep into the neoclassical economics because she really wants to understand that point of view, and I find that great. I really like that. I think that's the scientific way to go about things.
Yeah, it was really nice, I think, to hear that perspective of someone who has a very different background, going into economics with her eyes kind of already opened into what issues she'd likely to perceive, and finding them around every corner or every page of the notebook that she turned over. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting. Well, that's us almost at the end of the show. Any final thoughts from yourself and from the any final thoughts from the audience?
Yeah, I was going to say as well that she brought up some. I just want to reiterate some of the points that she brought up as well. I mean, you know, when she was talking about engineering, she was talking about engineering as being good engineering as the engineering that you don't know that the building is getting uncomfortable. It's not getting too hot. It's not getting too cold. And it would be nice if good economics did the same thing for the most of the population, felt comfortable. And also the thing of engineers as well as doctors having that duty of ethics.
Yeah.
They have to think about ethics. And I think that's something that clearly has to be in the economics profession as well, because they do influence people's lives in such massive ways when they're involved in policy at a governmental level.
Yeah, no, they're really, really good points. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We've got 4 new shows to announce, which we'll do tomorrow for the rest of March. Some really exciting stuff. Really keen to hear and for you to hear and to see it. So until next week, and we'll let you know what that is for the show tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining us, Kieran. Thanks. Nice to see you, and take it easy. See you later. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.